The plastic zip tie bit into his wrists, a sharp, humiliating line of fire. He wasn't a criminal. He was a father trying to get home for his daughter's first piano recital. But the two security officers flanking him, their faces set like stone, didn't care about piano recitals. They just cared about standard procedure. He felt hundreds of eyes on him as they marched him down the aisle of the Boeing 737, eyes of judgment, of pity, of morbid curiosity. He didn't look at them. He looked at the scuff on his own leather shoe, at the worn gray-blue carpet, at the flight attendant standing by the galley with her arms crossed, a look of vindicated triumph on her face. Her name tag read, Karen. Of course it did. He memorized it. He memorized the smarmy grin of the man in seat 3B who'd backed her story. He memorized the smell of cheap, recycled air and the faint, tinny sound of the captain's voice crackling over the intercom, apologizing for the brief delay. They pushed him onto the jet bridge, and the door to the plane clicked shut behind him with a gut-wrenching finality. This wasn't happening. An overbooked flight? A dispute over an overhead bin. He'd calmly stated his case, explaining that the bin above his assigned seat was already full. The man in 3B had shoved his oversized duffel in there. The flight attendant, Karen, had told him to find another spot. He had politely refused, stating the airline's own policy. That politeness, that quiet insistence, had been twisted into non-compliance, then aggression. Lies stacked one on top of the other until they formed a wall he couldn't break through. And then the pattern broke. As the security officers guided him toward the terminal, he didn't struggle, he didn't shout, he didn't plead. He stopped walking, and for a terrifying second the officers tensed, ready for a fight. But he just turned his head slightly, looked at the plane's tail number, N427UA, and committed it to memory. He went still, his breathing measured, his eyes scanning, recording. The officers exchanged a confused glance. His calm was more unsettling than any outburst. It felt like the eerie silence before a storm. They sat him in a sterile, windowless room, deep in the bowels of the airport. The chair was hard plastic, the table was bolted to the floor, the clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, 6:47 p.m. Leela's recital started in 13 minutes. He closed his eyes and saw her, a tiny figure in a pink dress, her small hands hovering over the piano keys, searching the crowd for his face. A promise, broken. That was the real crime here. Have you ever been punished for doing the right thing, for standing your ground so quietly that they mistook your dignity for defiance? Tell me in the comments when a system, a person, or a stupid rule made you feel powerless. An airline representative finally walked in, a woman named Cynthia with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She held a tablet. She didn't make eye contact. "Mr. Elias Thorne," she began, her voice dripping with corporate indifference. "Due to the incident on board Flight 1138, we have made the decision to deny you service for life." Elias didn't respond. He just stared at her, his silence a void she seemed desperate to fill. "The flight attendant reported aggressive behavior and a refusal to follow crew member instructions. It's a matter of safety, you understand, a zero-tolerance policy." "And my side of the story?" Elias's voice was raspy, low. "Does that have any value?" Cynthia finally looked at him, her expression a perfect mask of feigned sympathy. "Sir, we have 2 eyewitness accounts. It's standard procedure." There it was again. That phrase, standard procedure. The shield they used to justify cruelty, to excuse incompetence. He nodded slowly, a dark understanding dawning in his eyes. He had tried to play by their rules, the rules of a decent, ordinary man, but they weren't playing the same game. He saw the smug passenger from 3B walking past the open door of the room, on his way to a different gate, a free man. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The man gave a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. Betrayal, sharp and cold, twisted in his gut. It wasn't just the airline. It was the casual cruelty of a stranger who chose to lie for the simple, ugly sport of it. The world wasn't just. It was a playground for bullies. And today, he was the kid who got pushed in the dirt. The tension in the room thickened. This was no longer just about a missed flight or a broken promise. This was about the fundamental injustice of it all. He thought he was at his lowest point, sitting in this cold, white box, branded a problem for life by an airline he'd given his loyalty to for years. But then Cynthia slid a form across the table. "Sign here, acknowledging the terms of your ban," she said, her voice clinical. He looked at the paper, then back at her. A slow, chilling smile touched his lips for the first time. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed the exact weapon he needed. "No, I don't think I will," he said softly. He held up his wrists, still bound by the plastic tie. "First, I'd like to make a phone call. Or are my rights also against your standard procedure?" The officer, who had been standing silently in the corner, seemed to realize for the first time that they hadn't even read him his rights. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He cut the zip tie. Elias rubbed his wrists, the red marks already turning a deep purple. He pulled out his phone. It wasn't a fancy, flashy new model. It was simple, functional, and secure. He scrolled to a single contact, a name with no photo. Zara. He pressed the call button. She answered on the first ring. "Elias, is everything all right? I was expecting you to be in the air." Her voice was calm, efficient. "Change of plans," Elias said, his voice now devoid of all emotion. It was flat, cold. The voice he used when billions of dollars were on the line. "How are we looking on Project Nightingale?" There was a pause on the other end. The airline representative, Cynthia, was watching him with a bored expression, assuming he was calling a lawyer to file some pathetic little complaint. "It's promising," Zara said. "The analytics are solid. Their stock is undervalued, leadership is complacent, and their customer satisfaction metrics are, well, room for improvement. We're ready to present the initial investment proposal to the board next week. $7 billion. It'll be the friendly lifeline they need." Elias stared at a crack on the wall, tracing its path with his eyes. He thought of Lila's drawing of a nightingale she'd tucked into his pocket for good luck. A fragile bird, made with crayons. "Nightingale is grounded," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Permanently." Cynthia shifted, suddenly paying more attention. Something in his tone had changed. The victim was gone. "Elias, what happened?" Zara's voice was sharp with concern. "I just completed the final stage of our due diligence, in person. Their culture is rotten from the inside out. They treat their customers like criminals, and their staff are empowered to lie without consequence." He paused, letting the weight of his next words hang in the air. "Scrap the friendly approach. Initiate the alternative." Zara was silent for a full 5 seconds. "The alternative?" "Elias, that's a hostile takeover, a proxy fight. It's scorched earth. It'll cost more. It'll be a bloodbath." "I know, and I don't care. I want you to start shorting the stock, immediately. Use the secondary funds. I want you to leak the internal reports on their maintenance delays and the safety complaints their crews have filed, the ones their board has been burying. I want every institutional investor to know that this company is a house of cards. And then, when their stock is in the gutter, we don't buy a piece of it. We buy all of it." Cynthia's face had gone from bored to confused to pale white. She was frantically typing his name into her tablet, her fingers fumbling. Elias Thorne. The name meant nothing to her. A nobody. But the words she was hearing, 7 billion, hostile takeover, they didn't belong to a nobody. This was the moment. The room which had been his prison was now his stage. He wasn't the disgruntled passenger anymore. He was the shark they had mistaken for a goldfish. He was Elias Thorne, the founder and managing partner of Blackwood Capital, one of the most ruthless and effective private equity firms in the world. A man so private he didn't have a public photo. A man who flew commercial to stay connected to the real world, to see firsthand the companies he was considering investing in. And he had just seen everything he needed to see. Cynthia's tablet finally dinged with a result. A single encrypted corporate file she barely had the clearance to view. Her eyes widened in horror. Her jaw went slack. The tablet slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. "Zara,"
Elias continued, ignoring the woman who now looked like she'd seen a ghost. And find out who the man in seat 3B was. Find out where he works. Buy his company. I don't care what it is. A hot dog stand, a tech firm, buy it and fire him. He hung up. The silence that followed was absolute. The ticking of the clock had seemed to stop. The sterile room was now a vacuum, all the air sucked out of it by the sheer gravity of what had just happened. Cynthia was on the floor, scrambling for her tablet, her face a mess of panic and disbelief. The security officer was frozen, staring at Elias, as if seeing him for the first time. Not as a problem to be removed, but as a force of nature he had foolishly prodded. What would you do with that kind of power? Would you be merciful? Or would you burn it all to the ground? Let me know your honest answer below. The next 6 weeks were a masterclass in corporate annihilation. Blackwood Capital moved with surgical precision. The leaks Zara orchestrated hit the press like a coordinated bombing run. Stories of falsified maintenance logs, of pilots forced to fly planes with known issues, of a toxic corporate culture that punished whistleblowers, flooded the news. United American Airlines stock, once stable, began to hemorrhage value. It dropped 10% in the first week, 25% by the third. By the end of the month, it had lost nearly 60% of its market capitalization. Billions wiped out. Their board was in chaos. Their CEO, a pompous man named Richard Sterling, who Elias had once seen bragging on a business channel, was in full-blown panic mode. He held press conferences, promising transparency and a full internal review. But it was too late. The blood was in the water, and the sharks were circling. The biggest shark, of course, was Elias. He never showed his face. The entire takeover was orchestrated through Zara. Blackwood Capital issued a press release announcing its intention to acquire UAA, not to save it, but to restructure it from the top down. They offered shareholders a price that was barely above the stock's now decimated value. It was a brutal, take-it-or-leave-it offer. Most, desperate to cut their losses, took it. The day the deal closed, Elias walked into the UAA corporate headquarters. He wasn't escorted by security this time. He owned the building. He walked past the giant, gleaming logo in the lobby, the same logo that was on the tail of the plane he'd been thrown off of. He took the elevator to the top floor, to the CEO's office. Richard Sterling was there, packing his things into a cardboard box. He was a man broken. When he saw Elias walk in, he didn't recognize him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Elias Thorne," he said simply. Recognition dawned slowly, then crashed over Sterling's face like a tidal wave of ice water. He stumbled backwards, clutching the edge of his desk. "You're the one from the flight? From the incident report?" "I am," Elias said. He walked over to the vast window that overlooked the airport. He could see the planes taking off and landing, tiny silver birds in the distance. "Your flight attendant, Karen, from Flight 1138. She still works for this company. I can have her fired, instantly. And the man in 3B, we investigated. He works for a small marketing firm. I can ruin him." Sterling was desperate, grasping at straws. Elias turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "You still don't get it, do you, Richard? This was never about one flight attendant or one smug passenger. It was about a culture you built. A culture where a lie is easier than a solution. Where standard procedure is an excuse for having no standards. Firing her would be easy. You think I did this all for revenge?" He walked over to Sterling's desk and picked up a framed photo of the CEO shaking hands with a politician. "I did this because my daughter, Lila, gave me a crayon drawing of a nightingale for good luck on my trip, and I promised I'd be home for her recital. Your company, your culture, broke that promise. You don't just get to fire one person and fix that. You have to tear out the entire foundation." He put the photo frame down, face first, on the desk. Your services are no longer required. It's nothing personal, Elias said, the words landing like tiny shards of glass. It's just standard procedure. 6 months later, the airport was different. Or maybe he was. The air smelled the same, the sounds were the same, but the feeling of powerlessness was gone. Elias Thorne walked through the terminal not as a passenger, but as the chairman of the board. United American Airlines was now just American Airlines, rebuilt and rebranded. The new tagline, plastered on digital screens everywhere, was simple: promises kept. He saw her. Karen. She wasn't a flight attendant anymore. She was working the check-in counter, her face etched with a permanent stress that hadn't been there before. She looked tired, defeated. He had made sure she wasn't fired. That would have been too simple. Instead, she was retrained, moved to a position where every single day she had to face the customers her former attitude had so callously dismissed.
He walked toward her counter, her eyes flicked up, and for a heart-stopping moment, he saw a flicker of recognition followed by pure, unadulterated fear. She braced herself for the confrontation, for the final, humiliating blow. But Elias just walked past. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at her again. But as he passed, he slid something small across the counter. She looked down. It was a small laminated card. On it was a child's crayon drawing of a bird, a nightingale. He kept walking, pulling out his phone. He opened a video file and pressed play. The sound of a slightly out-of-tune piano filled his ears. On the screen, Leela, in a bright yellow dress, was playing her heart out at her school's spring concert. He smiled, a real, warm smile. He hadn't missed this one. He would never miss another one again. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about taking back your power. It's about the fact that every single person, from the CEO in the boardroom to the passenger in seat 34C, deserves respect. If you believe that our dignity is not a privilege but a right, hit that subscribe button, because this isn't just a story, it's a promise.